Hello, everyone. I'm Abebe Selassie, the director of the IMF's African Department. I'm very pleased to welcome you to Africa Perspective. This is a series during which we discuss pressing economic reform issues facing African policymakers. And today we have the great honor of hosting two most distinguished guests. Mavis Owusu-Gyamfi, Executive Vice President of the African Center for Economic Transformation, based in Accra, and Minister Lee White, Gabon's Minister of Water, Forest, Sea, and Environment. Sub-Saharan Africa has contributed little to global greenhouse gas emissions, and yet it is the region most vulnerable to climate change. Rising temperatures and sea levels, as well as rainfall anomalies, are increasing the frequency and intensity of natural disasters. Heavy dependence on rain-fed agriculture and limited ability to adapt to weather-related shocks means that the livelihoods of millions are threatened by climate-induced disasters. Substantial additional financing, that is, in addition to existing financing commitments to promote development, is urgently needed for resilient and green economic development. This is why policymakers and stakeholders are exploring sources of financing for climate action, something that we looked at recently in a STIFE climate note on climate finance in Sub-Saharan Africa. COP27, dubbed as the Africa COP, has recently ended. World leaders gathered in Sharm el-Sheikh to discuss how to mobilize collective efforts for ambitious emission reductions and adaptation. What are the key implications for Sub-Saharan Africa? What is needed to make the continent's development path resilient to climate change while preserving sustainability of public finances? How can the region attain a just energy transition without jeopardizing achievements of its development goals? Today, we are going to discuss these issues with our illustrious guests. Mavis Owusu-Gyamfi has built a stellar career over 25 years in international development. Prior to joining ASET, where she oversees its strategy and leadership, she worked at the United Kingdom's Department for International Development, where she led the creation and implementation of DFID's first private sector development strategies in a number of countries. More recently, she worked as the Director of Program Policy at Save the Children and Director of Investments at the Power of Nutrition. She holds an MPhil from the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. Lee White is Gabon's current Minister of Water, Forest, the Sea and Environment, in charge of climate change and land use plan. Prior to becoming minister, he served as the director of the Gabonese National Parks Agency for 10 years, having previously spent almost 20 years with Wildlife Conservation Society, fostering sound governance of natural resources and fighting against illegal fishing, ivory trafficking, gold mining, and forestry. Minister White is also an honorary professor at University of Stirling and holds a PhD on forestry's impact on wildlife and climate change from the University of Edinburgh. Thank you, Mavis. Thank you, Minister Lee, for participating in this event. If I could kick off with a question to you, Mavis. Sub-Saharan African countries, as you know, are of course the most vulnerable to climate change by any metrics. And within the continents, the poorest countries and the poorest sections of the population are often even more vulnerable. In your view, what should be the policy priorities to promote resilience to the climate crisis? And by way of follow-up, how could countries better coordinate to achieve these common goals? Over to you, Mavis.
No matter how much we do this, we always forget the mute button. Thank you very much, Abebe. And thank you very much for the invitation to join you on your discussion today. I think the number one policy priority for African countries today is to really think about structural transformation. For countries to secure resilient recovery and achieve sustainable development, they need to put structural transformation at the heart of their work. But this structural transformation needs to be embedded with strong climate and gender equality considerations. So, for example, when they're thinking about transforming their economies, they need to think about how they diversify their product and service lines. They need to think about how they make their exports more competitive, increase productivity, upgrade technology, and improve human well-being. And at Asset, we call this growth with depth. And why does this matter? From analysis that we've done at Asset, we know that countries that are making progress on transformation can better withstand shocks. They can better withstand fiscal shocks, financial shocks, and we are beginning to say that they can also better withstand the emergence of climate shocks. But to really ensure that they can do this, I think when they are thinking about their policies for transformation, some key issues need to be factored in. For example, are you considering how to utilize green energy? Are you considering how to employ circular economy principles? Are your industrialization policies really considering your carbon footprint and taking advantage of regional value chains under the AFCFTA? And there are lots of opportunities to do it. So just to give you a couple of examples, we have a rapidly growing textiles sector in East Africa and a dwindling cotton ginning industry in West Africa. Why can we not look at how to strengthen cotton production? Think about using modern technology, which reuses old fabrics and pulls out the cotton, and use that to produce the kind of cotton that is needed for the production in East Africa, rather than East Africa forever looking at Southeast Asia for their cotton. We saw examples of methane gas and how initiatives around skill training in the circular economy can really help poor people who are currently working on rubbish dumps in Sub-Saharan Africa. There are innovative ways of working in these areas. But at the heart of all of this, we cannot forget 50% of our population, which is the women who sit in agriculture. We have climate smart agriculture solutions. We can work around technology to scale up these solutions as part of our structural transformation agenda. So these are just some of the policies that I think countries really need to be thinking about. How do we make the climate crisis work for us in terms of generating job opportunities for our rapidly growing youth population?
Thank you so much, Mavis. That's a very nice opening perspective, and I'll come back to a number of the issues that you raised. Minister White, if I could turn to you now. Gabon, with your leadership, has been doing quite a lot of innovative stuff to generate, for example, to the recent agreement that you have as part of the Central African Forest Initiative, where I understand in exchange for demonstrating progress in forest protection and emission reduction, you have been able to secure a commitment for up to $150 million in financing from Norway. Can I ask, is this an experience that can be scaled up? How happy are you with the extent to which the resources are fungible for you to use that have been generated under this initiative? Over to you. And again, thank you for participating today.
Okay, thank you, and good to see you. I hope I'm not looking as red as I seem to have appeared in the screen on my computer. Maybe I am. That's a complicated question, actually. I think if you look at the history of negotiations in the UN Climate Change Convention, back in 2005, rainforest countries launched the concept of reducing emissions from deforestation, RED, in the Montreal COP. And it was Costa Rica and Papua New Guinea that launched that. It took us 10 years to get to Paris, where a specific article in the Paris Agreement was made for what had become known as RED+. reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, and then all of the sort of conservation and reforestation measures that can be used to maintain forests and rehabilitate ecosystems, potentially going beyond forests into savannas and soil restoration and so on. And so REDD+ was the great hope that we could harness nature-based solutions, and that, as you said, Africa, that has only contributed 3% or so of global emissions, which is highly susceptible to the impacts of climate change, could harness our ecosystems across the forests and woodlands and savannas, and kind of restore and preserve in order to help mitigate climate change, which is absolutely critical to development in Africa. We know that Africa will be completely destabilized if we continue on the same trajectory that we are today. Kofi Annan predicted 10 years ago that climate change would lead to war in over half of the African countries and hundreds of millions of climate refugees on the continent. And so, payment for reduced emissions, increased sequestration was a great hope. And because at the UNFCCC we worked by consensus, it took us 10 years to design the methodology, to approve the methods and the safeguards and so on. And in the meantime, Gabon signed this great agreement with Norway, which was a results-based payment system where Norway provides aid money, basically, from their taxpayers to fund projects in Gabon. These are restricted to projects that preserve rainforests and ecosystems. So we can't build hospitals and schools with this money. We're constrained to spend the money actually on doing a better job on managing forests and the environment. But a significant contribution from the Norwegian taxpayers, and Norway is one of the very few countries that has really respected its engagements under the UNFCCC. Partly on the basis of their contribution, partly through investment by the Gabonese government, we finally got to the point 3 or 4 months ago, actually during the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, that we validated Gabon's REDD+ credits that were created through the UNFCCC. So we validated 90 million tons of REDD+ credits and a further 97 million tons of high forest, low deforestation credits. So total of 197 million tons of credits that are the result of those 10 years of negotiations on methods and then 5-6 years of very intense work in Gabon, partly to reduce deforestation and degradation of the forest, but also to generate all of the methodologies we need to monitor deforestation. We created a space agency we sent out hundreds of researchers to make carbon plots and so on. And we're one of a small club of countries that have now created REDD+ credits through the UNFCCC, countries like Brazil, Costa Rica, Belize, Honduras, Papua New Guinea. And having created these credits, where the Paris Agreement, which is it's not legally binding, but it's a very, very strong pact between developing and developed nations, a moral contract at least, to pay for results. Well, when we finally have the results and we're ready to have them paid for, we've been told, well, maybe you should go and see the voluntary markets and see if they're willing to buy your carbon credits. It seems like there is no results-based payment through the UNFCCC, through the UN, through these agreements with the developed nations. And that is extremely worrying, because if we can't count on Article 5 of the Paris Agreement, can we count on any of the other articles that we agreed to in the Paris Agreement to create fungible money? We have to invest significantly to create these carbon units, credits, whatever you call them. if Gabon fails to monetize its REDD+ credits, what is there to encourage other countries in the Congo Basin, in West Africa, and across the tropics to go through all of the hard work that we've done in Gabon? And so I think we've reached a sort of a litmus point, a litmus test, a real test of the commitment to the Paris Agreement and then everything we decided in Glasgow. And I think it's really critical to the process that we find a way forwards. It's a somewhat rough, choppy sea because there's a lot of criticism right now of the voluntary carbon mechanisms that grew up alongside the UNFCCC, partly because we work by consensus. It takes 10 years to agree a strong framework. Many other frameworks grew up much more quickly and were perhaps weaker than the UNFCCC. And so I think over the next 6 to 12 months, we're going to judge whether or not the world is serious about these REDD+ credits. And the stance taken by the IMF, where there's talk about potentially exchanging debt against carbon or making future debt cheaper for countries that are carbon positive or biodiversity positive. I think we need to put all of our heads together to think about how we really achieve this moving forward. Because if there is a carbon market, Africa's ecosystems could contribute significantly to the fight against climate change. And if we restore our soils and our ecosystems, that will allow us to do carbon positive agriculture, which will be more productive on lands which are more sustainable, creating rural livelihoods that are sustainable, and bringing the whole process of adaptation and mitigation together on our continent. But we really need decisive action over the next, I would say the next 12 months,
Okay.
if countries are not going to lose faith in the process.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Minister Lee. I mean, I was very excited that you had agreed to join exactly because of how much Gabon is in the vanguard on this area. So I'll come back to you with a question. Mavis, if I could come back to you and a two-part question, please. I mean, one, I would be interested to hear your thoughts on what Minister Lee was just laying out, the difficulty of engendering additional financing to support even the conservation efforts that countries like Gabon are well on the way to undertaking. And then the second part of the question is, I mean, you mentioned earlier about the importance of more diversification to get our countries to be more resilient to climate change. It's something we wholeheartedly agree with here at the IMF. But it's not just financing that's needed to make our economies resilient, our countries resilient. There's also a very important reform agenda. What, in your view, assets work shows to be the more important types of policy reforms that are needed? I know it's difficult to generalize for the continent, but if you could weigh in a little bit on what the policy agenda would also look like. Thank you, Mavis.
Thank you very much, Abebe, and thank you, Minister White. I think, if I begin by saying Minister White is spot on. And for us at ASSET, a key message that we are pushing these days is that for just transition to work, Africa needs a much stronger voice at the tables where key decisions are being made on climate finance. So areas such as the IFI boards and the G20. Our limited voice means that a lot of the decisions are being made for Africa and not necessarily with Africa. So Minister White talked about carbon credits, etc. And I'd like to just pick on one component of it. If we look at the just transition debate, there is a real push for African countries like the DRC to protect its national reserves, such as the Congo Basin. And we agree, biodiversity protection is a global public good that we must all contribute to. However, a lot of the countries that are being looked to play this role are sitting on huge fiscal challenges today. Huge. They are navigating, high interest rates in the debt market. They are navigating debt crisis. They are navigating the fallout from both COVID and the Russian-Ukraine war. And simultaneously, we seem to have spoken about a loss and damage fund at COP27 that we are far from clear on what the implementation plan should be. So we should be looking at innovations, and there are a number of ways in which we can find some of these innovations. So let's think through a transportation tax. It will hit those of us who fly a lot, but we are all contributing to this agenda. Carbon taxes. There are ways in which we can find innovative solutions to dealing with this fundamental challenge of just transition. But hopefully we can come back to that issue. In terms of the policies that you are talking about, I agree with you. It's not just about more money. We need robust macroeconomic policies on the African continent. We need robust fiscal strategies. We really also need to think about fundamental issues such as industrial policies. Are we looking at the areas for growth that we can invest in that can really offer opportunities for our rapidly growing population? We need to think through our agriculture. We talk a lot. Africa has been talking about agriculture as the basis for growth for a number of years. But if you look at value addition, it remains continually a small percentage of our economies. So, we have a broad spate of, macro and micro policies that we need to look at. But the issues are not just about writing the policies. It's also about implementing those policies. If you look across Sub-Saharan Africa, we have a number of gender equality policies that are focused on improving women's access to finance and economic development. Yet, less than 20% of these policies are effectively implemented. If you look at our cost of doing business, we all have excellent policies around improving the investment climate. But when it comes to actual implementation, our institutional frameworks remain weak to facilitate effective implementation. We need to move into the space of effective implementation. If I dare say this, Abebe, we need to shift from writing new policies to actually looking at, implementation of the policies that we've already committed to. If we did that in the next 5 years, we would really start to see the progress around diversification and export competitiveness that we are talking about. We've all signed up to AfCFTA. A number of countries have signed up to movement of people. A number of countries have signed up to the trade protocols. But that's the easy bit. The real challenging part is the implementation of it. And that implementation is what is going to distinguish us from a truly competitive regional market in the world. So money is just a small side of it.
Thank you, Mavis. Thank you. Very good points. Minister White, if I could come back to you. The message that you shared with us about the difficulty of attracting carbon credits, even when you've done so much work in Gabon to prove that you can and explain very clearly that you are protecting your valuable rainforest. I can think of broadly 3 arguments why this is not advancing. I think one argument that I've heard about carbon credits is that fundamentally they do not reduce carbon emission, right? But rather kind of they shift. And of course compensate some for existing emissions. So that's one argument that I can see not helping advance the effectiveness of a carbon credit market. And then the second argument, I think, is that advanced countries who, for the most part, are of course continue to be emitters, and some large emerging market countries, they just do not have the political will to come up with the required resources to do these transfers. I think so, more of a political argument rather than kind of an economic one. A third set of arguments, of course, that I had heard in the past was, that countries are unable to show indeed that they are preserving the forest. But it seems that in Gabon you have proof of concept that this can be done, from what you were telling us earlier. So I discount that. In your opinion, which one of these two arguments is it? More the economic ones, or the more political issue of not being able to come up with the resources needed to transfer to countries like Gabon that's hindering progress?
Yeah, I think as Mavis says, we develop policies, we fail to implement, and as an excuse almost, we develop new policies. So if we make that analogy to the carbon situation, we spent 10 years developing REDD+, and then multiple developing nations spent 5, 6, 7 years creating these REDD+ credits. And now we're being told, well, that's very good, but nobody's buying REDD+ credits, but maybe we could work on biodiversity credits. And maybe, the message is, maybe in 15 years' time, we'll tell you, no, actually, biodiversity credits don't work either. So to answer your question, there is a lot of hot air, both in the old clean development mechanism and now in the voluntary carbon markets. And so there's been a lot of criticism the last few weeks in the press and in the scientific publications of avoided deforestation credits created through voluntary mechanisms where up to 90% are considered to be just hot air, meaningless. We spent 10 years developing the Warsaw Framework in the UNFCCC to avoid just that, to make REDD+ credits developed through the UNFCCC into something that is real. In some ways, when you say they don't reduce carbon emissions, it's sort of, you're almost right, because inevitably we're always looking backwards. There's always a delay in the data gathering and system. So we won't be putting 2023 credits on the market until 2025, 2026, because there's a delay in compiling all of the data, and then that data has to be audited. And within the UNFCCC, you have to do 2 different audits, each of which take on average a year. So inevitably, we're then looking backwards, and you could say, well, that's what you did in the past. That doesn't change the future. But I don't think that's a valid comment. So we're looking at past credits for Gabon. Because Gabon is a high forest, low deforestation country, because our forestry activities that cover 60% of our country are carbon positive and result in increased carbon stocks in our logged forests, because we're 22% protected on land, we're actually one of a small club of countries that net absorb carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So we offset all of our emissions, and over and above all of our emissions, we absorb just over 100 million tons of carbon dioxide every year. To create our 90 million tons of carbon credits, if you look at just the net absorption out of the atmosphere, Gabon removed just over 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And the
over
methodology
what time frame? Sorry, this 1 billion, over what time frame?
It's a 10-year reference.
10 years, okay.
And so our 90 million tons are over 10 years, okay. and we absorbed over 1 billion tons of carbon over that period. And so every single one of the Gabon REDD+ credits results in an additional 10 tons of carbon dioxide being removed net out of the atmosphere. They're the best value carbon credits there are in terms of what the atmosphere sees. So for every 1 ton of carbon credit created through REDD+ in Gabon, we remove 11 tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. That's the opposite to these avoided emissions where we're guesstimating that maybe for every credit there are 9 credits that are invalid and not real. And so I think number 2, the political will to pay, that's absolutely it. The developed nations do not want to respect the Paris Agreement. They're not willing to put the money on the table to pay the $15, $20, $25 that we know it's going to cost. Costa Rica, that have very good systems, it costs them $18 per ton to create a carbon credit. And so unless they're being paid more than that, Costa Rica is subsidizing the rest of the world by creating carbon credits. Same thing in Gabon, same thing in Papua New Guinea, same thing elsewhere. The stark reality, and it's a horrible thing to say, it pains me to say it, but in Africa, climate change is a life and death situation. In Africa, it's a life and death situation for tens of millions of people today. In the Horn of Africa, the figure is 22 million people at risk of starvation through drought, and drought that has been exacerbated by climate change. And if we let climate change run its course, if we go to a 3 or 4 degree world, then literally we will have hundreds of millions of climate refugees, and tens or hundreds of millions of Africans will be dying. And in most advanced countries, it is not a life and death situation. We have seen what looks like it looks like we might be at an inflection point. We've seen, the worst drought in 500 years in the UK. We're seeing vast forest fires throughout the Mediterranean. The forests of Norway and Sweden and Finland are being decimated by insects and diseases. Floods, the floods that hit Pakistan, but the New York subway turning into Niagara Falls and water pouring into the New York subway. Until those phenomena are impacting millions, tens, hundreds of millions of people in developed countries, the developed countries are not going to act fast enough. They're not going to put enough money on the table to deal with it, because it's a problem in 30 years for many of these countries, or 50 years. We saw how we dealt with COVID, trillions of dollars mobilized to deal with an immediate problem, because for politicians, we had to deal with that. We see how developed nations are dealing with the fuel crisis in Europe right now. Of course, they're not going to let their people freeze to death in their homes, and so they're using more coal. And thinking about in the future, they can wean themselves off coal and use renewables. But because climate is a sort of decadal problem, politicians like me, who tend to be on 4 or 5 year election cycles, are just not willing to mobilize the money that every single economic study tells us we should mobilize, and will save us money and will save lives in the future if we do it today, but we don't do it. And so it's just another example, I think, of the fact that no, there is not the willingness to play. No, we're not taking climate change as seriously as we need to. No, nobody's listening to the IMF economic projections of what climate change is going to cost the world economy if we don't deal with it today, because it's a problem for future politicians to deal with.
Thank you for that very, very candid and powerful intervention, Minister White. Really very powerful. And I couldn't agree more about what an existential threat climate change is already to many of our people in the region. I mean, the drought you mentioned, not just in the Horn, but through the Sahel, really devastating effects on people as we speak. Pivoting to a little bit more forward-looking and unpacking what can be done. I think one of the things that we are very proud here at the IMF is the creation of the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. through the rechanneling of SDRs from advanced countries that can be on-lent to countries with robust climate, robust programs to address climate change issues. This, I think we're very proud because it's incremental financing. I think one of the few sources of incremental financing to support the climate change agenda. Mavis, if I could start with you, can you say a little bit about, what in our dialogue with countries as we roll out these programs, what kind of policy areas are going to be important to get countries to address?
Thank you very much, Abebe. I think, ultimately, African economies need to be on a green growth path. We all agree on that. This will benefit the whole world, but it will also create the jobs that the continent desperately needs for its rapidly growing youth population. So I think the kinds of conversations that you should be having with countries is around how how they can use this financing to support strategies that enables them to move towards the green growth path. So, for example, on the financing side, the IMF and other partners can really support African countries to develop the kind of policies that they need to access carbon offset markets, to be able to do things like, debt for nature swaps. We know these things can have a huge impact in the short term on the financial crisis that countries are facing today. But most importantly, it can have a long-term impact on the climate. So if I borrow from Minister White's earlier points that ministers are thinking about their short-term needs, short-term, a lot of ministers are thinking right now about finance. But you can achieve both that short-term need of ministers today and the long-term need of the world on climate impact if you have some of these, if you can help countries to develop some of these policies. And I know that the world doesn't like the word conditionalities, but there should always be some level of results-based conditions around these investments. So it can be around issues like investing, incentivizing countries to invest in green growth strategies. So to think more around renewable strategies, to think more cleverly around climate smart agriculture, to think more around forest reserves, so that there are really innovative ways in which you can help use the RST to inject capital now, but really inject it in a way that enables us to realize that ambition that we are all working towards around better climate resilience for the world's future.
Thank you, Mavis. Thank you. It's very, very helpful. Minister White, if I could come to you. I mean, the picture you painted earlier was one where there's limited financing or limited political appetite to support initiatives like carbon credit, at the moment at least. Of course, a battle that's ongoing. Can I ask, is it time to consider other initiatives that have been discussed in the past that are perhaps less cheaper? I mean, things like, as one of our listeners has asked, the Green Wall Initiative to plant trees along the Sahel. There have been a number of these kind of initiatives that perhaps with limited resources can be embarked upon and will be beneficial to our countries. Is it also time to put issues like that on the table?
Absolutely. I think even though we're in different ecosystems, there's a lot of similarities between preserving the rainforests of Congo Basin and where they're degraded, restoring them, and the Green Wall, which is about replanting ecosystems, planting trees to restore ecosystems, to cool the planet down, to help nature start making the rainfall again, because by replanting forests, you increase local rainfall patterns. You're storing carbon in the trees, you're restoring the soils, you're storing carbon in the soils, which is much more stable than carbon stored in vegetation. But if we're going to achieve the vision of the Great Green Wall of planting trees across, the whole of the kind of Sahelian Africa, I'm not an expert, but I've seen budgets measured in tens of billions of dollars to achieve the entire thing. So if we're just going to have a few school kids planting trees in their school and the odd village planting trees, we're not going to achieve the really important goals of the Great Green Wall initiative. If there was a real ecosystem carbon market out there, then we can mobilize the power of the private sector. And we all know whether it's kind of industry or in Gabon, we're doing sustainable forestry to save the forest, but most of that is done by the private sector. It's the government makes sure they follow the rules and puts in place some incentives. Unless we can really engage the private sector on the Great Green Wall, I worry that it will not achieve all of its goals. And so, whether it's in the Sahel, whether it's restoration, whether it's reduced emissions from deforestation, I think maybe where governments can play a role in a world where there's some doubt about integrity of these schemes, we need a body that can vouch for the integrity of Gabon's carbon credits. It seems like the UNFCCC methods are not quite enough. We might need something additional. We need governments to validate. If the French government, the British government, the US government tells their investors that Gabon credits are really good value, what Lee White just said about 11 to 1 is real, and in addition to that, they're biodiversity positive, such that the L'Oreals and Louis Vuittons and BPs and Exxons of this world can buy those credits without the fear that they will be criticized by public NGO and particularly by their governments. That may well be the beginnings of a solution. We have to mobilize the private sector on these issues if we're going to go to scale. We talk about $100 billion that will be mobilized by developed nations every year for climate change on the basis of the Paris Agreement and the Copenhagen Agreement. It seems like about $85 billion were mobilized last year. I'm afraid in Gabon, I've not seen even 1% of what I would have qualified as our fair share of that money coming into my country. And I hear the same story from all the other Congo Basin ministers.
But if I could follow up on that,
$100 billion alone will not get us anywhere. That needs to, it needs to multiply times 10 or 100, and the only way to do that is private sector. And I'm sure IMF, you're thinking about that, and you have an important role to play there alongside the World Bank and so on.
We are actually huge work agenda on this issue as we speak, Minister, why we also wanted to have this conversation. If I could just follow up quickly on a couple of points that you made. First, this point about this, you said 88 billion seems to have been mobilized last year, and Gabon has not seen any of it. So where is this $88 billion in additional climate finance going? I'm really, I've heard of, we've all heard of this $100 billion figure. being said.
Since we created, and I played maybe a big role in creating our carbon credits, some people have been calling me a green finance specialist, and I'm not. I'm a biologist, but
Yes.
when just for the ease of my sums, let's say there's 100 billion out there. Africa is 1/3 of the developing nations, of the 152 developing nations. Africa's more susceptible to climate change. So maybe we'd get, let's say 40% of the 100 billion should flow into Africa, into the 54 countries. Gabon is 1/100th of the surface area of Africa. So we're a below average size country. So if our share of the 40 billion is now 1/100th, we should be seeing $400 million per year flowing into Gabon. We are a medium revenue country, so we're a slightly richer country than many African countries. So let's half our share to 200 because we have more means, and we are not a particularly vulnerable country. So let's half it again, and maybe I'm shooting myself in the foot here. So I've taken Gabon's allocation down to $100 million per year of additional money for climate. What I'm seeing is about 1 million. We did do that deal with Norway. We did it a while back. If we count that's over 10 years. So if we count that, we're still getting only maybe less than 10% of what we are due. Now, is that a capacity issue? Because many African countries don't have the expertise to ask for the money in a way that it will be approved by the IMF or the GCF, maybe. But there has to be a mechanism whereby that money flows to where it's needed. Where is it? That's one of the best kept secrets in finance. OECD are analyzing how much money has flown, but they're not yet analyzing how much money has hit the ground. That might be a very good thing for us to deliver in Dubai at COP28, a genuine analysis, not only of how much money has been committed, how much has actually been transferred, where it is, and how much of it has hit the ground in developing nations. I think if we did that analysis, it would help us a lot on both sides of the equation to better understand where the problems are and how we deal with them, because African countries are definitely not getting their fair share and are not getting the money that we need in order to create whatever the priority is. Whether it's climate resilient agriculture, climate resilient infrastructure, investing in preserving or restoring ecosystems, dealing with diseases that are emerging because of climate change. The needs are great. The flows of money are confusing, and I think almost across the board disappointing.
Thank you so much, Minister. Thank you. Mavis, one of the issues that Asset and yourself in particular were championing, of course, is how important it is to consider gas as an important transition energy source ahead of COP27 in particular. Can you update us on where that debate stands and your perspectives on this, please?
So, I think the debate on gas stands. That's the best I could say right now. So I think the challenge we have at the moment is, let's start with the fundamental problem. We need to address the continent's energy poverty. We all acknowledge that just energy transition has huge potential for creating jobs for the continent. And we also know that it could generate income for us. So at a carbon price of $50 per ton, implementing nature-based carbon removal practices could contribute to this agenda. But the challenge we have today is that more than half of our population do not have access to electricity, and only 17% have access to clean cooking solutions. So they are relying on biomass. We also have the issue of a lack of access to climate finance. The Minister White talked a lot about, where is the money disappearing to? Is it capacity building? Is it technology? We are seeing less than 20% of the money on climate finance coming to the continent. And we know that to build a just energy transition, we need to have the resources and the technology to do this. And it's a no-brainer. Abebe, over 300,000 of our children are dying annually from acute respiratory tract infections. And our current processes of energy are not working. Having said all of this, let's be honest in saying and recognizing that African countries have made great progress towards, using green energy. So we have a number of countries that have increased their uptake of renewable energy. And over the past decade, solar PV has increased by 20-fold, whilst wind energy has increased by 7-fold. But we have a problem with the technologies associated with this energy. One is intermittency issues associated with renewable. That still requires improved technology to fix it. And then the second is the challenges around storing energy in batteries. We still have a problem with that. And then, of course, climate change means that hydroelectric that a number of countries have been using can no longer be relied on in a number of countries going forward. So I think at COP27, when the world talked about resolve to boost low emissions energy, a number of African countries interpreted that as, commitment towards the natural gas issue. However, most countries lack the financial capacity to rebuild, to build the required infrastructure to use gas. And developed countries have stuck to the COP26 commitment of not allowing their DFIs to invest in any carbon technology, including gas, okay? So we find ourselves in this situation where it's, chicken or egg situation, but it's made more difficult by the fact that, as Minister White said earlier on, a number of countries right now are talking about going back to coal, and they are going back to coal.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because of the energy crunch. So for us, the question is, what is the grown-up conversation, the real partnership conversation that we need to have on this issue? ASET is not proposing that we should use gas forever. It's not sustainable, but we have a transition period. If it's not gas, what is the alternative? But the current position of it's green energy or nothing, it's not tenable. And it goes back to the point I'm making around where is the voice of Africa for this conversation? We need to have an open conversation, a partnership conversation around our globe. And this is one of those key issues for that partnership conversation.
Thank you so much, Mavis. Minister White, I'm afraid, there's so many things we could have explored, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. I want to thank our listeners for joining today's event also. Mavis, thank you so much for participating and lending your powerful voice to this conversation. Minister White, also, thank you for your really, really insightful and powerful intervention. I take from this, two wishes that I heard you speak that will influence our work here at the IMF. Mavis, I hear you on the need for our countries, our people to have a stronger voice in the discussion that's taking place right now on what African countries and our people need to help advance the climate change challenge, to help meet the climate change challenge. And Minister White, I take full-heartedly the point you made about the need for a really robust study that looks at what and where existing resources, where existing resources are going to in this climate change financing discussion. Thank you again to the audience for participating and attending this event. Until next time, thank you so much.